Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture where I'll be talking to you about the two different types of interviews that you'll need to conduct in order to generate rich, insightful data for your country profiles. So here's an overview of today's lecture. So I'll begin by talking about interview as a qualitative form of data collection. I'll then move on to talk about the two specific types of interview that you'll need to conduct for your country profiles, and that is a YouTube video interview and a SoundCloud audio interview. I'll then move on to talk about some specific interview techniques that can help to develop and hone and perfect your interview skills. So this will include things like active listening, for example, and also talk about the importance of rejecting reflexive listening. Okay. I'll then talk to you about an activity that I'd like you to do this week. So this will be in your spare time. I'd like you guys to conduct a practice interview. I'll then move on to talk about specific types of questions that you can use in your interview in order to structure it, in order to help orientate the interview, and in order to make sure that you get at the specific information that you need in order to produce the best possible country profile. I'll conclude the lecture by showing some best practice examples from previous semesters. So specifically, I'll look at some examples from Team Bahamas and also Team Nigeria and also from Team Brazil. And then finally, I'll conclude the lecture by showing some examples of transcription. So remember, you will have to transcribe both your YouTube video and your SoundCloud audio interview. So I'll show some examples from previous semesters of what that actually looks like in practice. And I'll also show how previous teams have done some preliminary analysis of their interview data. Remember, ultimately, all of this is about generating rich, insightful, impactful quotes and extracts that you can directly use in your CP. Now remember, here in the course we're collecting 3 different types of research, okay? So in previous lectures I talked about SurveyMonkey. That will be generating rich quantitative data that you can utilize in your country profiles. You'll also be conducting desk-based research as part of your country profile. And then in today's lecture I'll be talking to you about the third component of research, and that's interviews. Okay, so interviews will really help in terms of generating rich experiential data that you can use to support some of the claims and some of the arguments that you're making in your CPs. Now, remember, here at CCBS, what we're really interested in is trying to understand what does leadership look like in the specific country that you're investigating. Okay, we're trying to gain insight into cross-cultural leadership skills and practices. And in order to do that, we're going to use some academic concepts, of course. Things like Hofstede's idea of power distance, empathic understanding, and we'll use particular terms like transactional leadership, transformational leadership, hierarchy, and so on. And ultimately, we're trying to understand, okay? We're trying to understand from experts in the field, from leaders who have knowledge and experience of living and breathing in organizations in the countries that you're investigating. And like all research and researchers, we're using tools in order to generate and get at that data and to gain insight into these people's rich experiences. So we'll be using surveys, we'll be using previous research, and you guys will be conducting your own interviews. Now remember, we're not necessarily an academic course per se, okay? So we're trying to generate insights into the how and why of leadership in your particular countries. So we're trying to add to the cumulative knowledge on leadership skills and practices. So we're trying to add to academic work, but we're also trying to directly inform leaders and other employees who are potentially going to be conducting business in the countries that you're writing about. So it's a practical guide, if you will, to help people avoid some of the cultural misunderstandings that Xander has talked about in his lectures, for example. Now, you'll be collecting both primary and using, some of you that will, using secondary data. So primary data, remember, is new data that's collected by you guys for the purposes of your CP. So this is your survey data and also your interview data, okay? But some of you also have the opportunity to draw upon secondary data. So remember, this is prior CCBS surveys that have been conducted by other teams like yourself in previous semesters. So on the screen here, you'll see what countries have had surveys conducted there previously. So some of you, St. Martin, Zimbabwe, Papua New Guinea, Liechtenstein, Macau, you guys have a greater challenge in that respect. But it's also an opportunity for you guys to be the first researchers of your kind to generate rich data about your under-researched countries. For those countries who have had surveys conducted previously, you guys will also be able to draw upon that secondary data to support and strengthen some of the arguments that you're making. Also, once you collect over 50 new survey respondent data, you'll also be able to add this to the pre-existing surveys, again, to reinforce the points that you're making. You might even be able to show whether there's been some change in leadership over the course of the last few years as well. So it's really useful stuff. Now, as part of generating primary data for your CPs, you'll be conducting two different types of interviews. So one will be a YouTube video interview with a leadership consultant or a cross-cultural trainer in the country you're investigating. And the other interview will be an audio SoundCloud interview with a leadership scholar in your country. And remember, by a leadership scholar, we mean an academic who is ideally based at a university in the country you're investigating, who is writing about, conducting studies about business leadership skills and practices in your country. Okay? So one point I just want to flag up just now is more of a technical issue, but this is in relation to OneDrive. So when you have your video interviews later in the course, please never upload these onto OneDrive, okay? Textbook explains that we'd like you to use Wispio in order to do this, just because the file sizes are too big. The audio interviews, by comparison, SoundCloud are allowed to be uploaded on OneDrive. And again, there are specific sections in textbook that describe all of this in detail. So please go and get it if you haven't already. Now, there are two specific sections, as you can see here, in the CP that specifically address these interviews. So one, as I say, is an interview with a leadership scholar, an academic who is writing about business skills and practices in the country you're investigating. And the other is a cross-cultural trainer or leadership consultant. So primarily, all of the rich data that you gather from these two professionals will be included in this section, including some background information about who they are, what their work experience is, and what their kind of specialist area of knowledge is. But please keep in mind that you can also use extracts from these interviews in other sections. So perhaps they might produce a really impactful quote that you think is useful for your introduction. You can also use it in order to support academic sources and to support some of the survey information and data that you'll be citing in the other sections as well. So you can use these interviewees' direct quotes to illustrate, to provide an example of something which is raised in the survey, or to provide more richer detail of a point which is perhaps raised in your survey data. So keep that in mind. The better, the richer the data, the more you can utilize it across multiple sections in your CP. Now, I'm pointing you here towards YouTube. So as hopefully all of you will be aware now, YouTube is our kind of depository for videos from previous semesters. So I'm showing you the screen to raise a couple of particular issues that I just want to flag up. So what you can see here in relation to the Japanese interview of this particular scholar is the thumbnail. So we have a standardized thumbnail that you can see in some of the images here. So these standardized thumbnails are in OneDrive. They're in OneDrive folder, the interview folder. And again, we would like you to use the CCBS branding, to use the standardized templates that are available to you, because we're interested in developing a brand here at CCBS at the end of the day. So it's important to look at some of these examples on YouTube to see the kind of standard that we're looking for. Another thing I want to flag up is that you can also see that some of these interviews here, such as this interview with a professional for Suriname, also has subtitles. So again, ideally, we would like you to use subtitles in your YouTube interview. Now in Textbook, what you'll see is that YouTube actually does this for you automatically, so it's really useful. But Xander has also included some examples of other software, free and paid software, that you can use to automatically generate transcriptions for you. And then finally, and I'll show this in a video later as well, I just want to flag up this example here from Sina Vent Moore on leadership in New Zealand. What you can see there in the image is that the question is actually presented on the screen in freeze frame. So I just want to raise a point here about the YouTube interview. And in your YouTube interview, what we would like in the end product, so when you finally produce the edited version, ultimately the interviewer's questions and any comments from the interviewer should not be in the interview. Okay? The questions that you ask rather should be presented on the screen as they are here. Okay? So I'll show an example of this later when I talk about a best practice example. But it's really important to check out YouTube to see how other people have done it in the past. So I'd just like to play a video just now from a former student on the course who will talk to you about the importance of the interview in your CP.
Een van de leerdoelen die ik heb meegenomen van de CCBS Minor is dat het belangrijk is hoe je de aanpak van vragenstelling doet. Je moet je daarbij voorstellen dat het belangrijk is om door te vragen bij interviews. Je probeert zoveel mogelijk informatie en data te krijgen uit de mensen die je interviewt en die wil je dan weer stoppen in het boek. Dus blijf vooral doorvragen. Laat de vraagstelling ook lekker specifiek zijn. De informatie die je mist in het boek en in het hoofdstuk. Probeer dat soort informatie juist eruit te krijgen bij deze mensen.
Okay, so what's really useful about that is particularly the final point made there, and that's the idea that the interview is a real opportunity to gather as much data and to perhaps plug some of the gaps in academic literature or some of the other gaps that are in your CP. What haven't you found data for? Okay, so the interviewees, given their expertise, represent a real opportunity for you to try and gain that insight and help to plug those gaps in your CP. Now, it's useful to perhaps think about a definition of an interview in order to flag up certain important key features. So an interview can be defined as a meeting or conversation in which a writer, researcher or reporter asks questions of one or more persons from whom material is sought for a newspaper story, television broadcast, or for our purposes, developing a research paper. So keep in mind, an interview is a conversation, but it's a very particular type of conversation. So while it shares some of the characteristics of how we converse with friends, for example, it's very different. So it's very different because it follows certain rules and it follows certain structures, okay? So there are structural differences between this type of conversation and other conversations that you might have. It's more formal, it's more organized, and in essence it's a particular type of performance, and we want you to treat it as such, okay? So you're talking with people who are leaders in their field, so they have a high status, and they're also giving up their time, and their time is precious. So we want the interviews to be as professional as possible, okay? So keep that in mind. What I'm going to help you with today is how to make it as professional and organized and structured as possible, to utilize their time, to make it worthwhile for them, and to make sure that you guys elicit as much detail as you possibly can. Remember, you're trying to get everything that they have in their head, you're trying to extract and put it into your CPs to give insight into people about what it's like to conduct business in that particular country. Now, in this respect, the interview is what we call in social science research a qualitative interview method. So surveys are about collecting quantitative data, numbers in some respects, but qualitative data is really about trying to get at the whys and hows of human behavior. Why and how do people do what they do? Okay, so in this respect, qualitative research methods such as interviews are really about collecting in-depth data about people's lives, behavior. Okay, so interviews are a really useful method for researchers because they help to elicit experiences, opinions, biographical details about who people are, where they've come from, what values and attitudes they hold, but also it helps us gain insight into their knowledge and experience. So remember, you're talking to C-level managers who will have extensive experience of being a leader in your particular country. Okay, so we're really interested in gaining insight into their knowledge and experience and really framing it in terms of their voice, their experiences, their feelings. And one of the ways through which you'll use this in the CP is by directly quoting them. So we're actually directly quoting their voice in the CP, and this will help the CP to come to life. It'll help it to be more local, and it will help it to be richer. So what I'm going to do just now, before we talk about some features of what makes a good interview, I just want to play this short interview extract, which will hopefully illustrate what a bad interview looks like. Okay?
Okay, Alex, I want to interview you and talk to you about doing a PhD.
Hang on, what's this thing going here?
It's okay, it's okay. It's just a digital recorder. It's basically recording the interview. It'll be fine, it'll be fine. So
Right, okay.
Can we start?
Right, fine, okay.
Okay, brilliant. I want to talk to you about doing a PhD and your experience of doing a PhD.
Yeah.
Were you isolated at all?
I guess at the beginning I kind of felt that I was a little bit isolated.
So you were isolated?
Well, at the beginning, but I think as time went on, I sort of...
Oh yeah, let's talk about, I just want to really kind of talk about isolation. So how did you feel isolated?
Well, like I say, I guess I did feel a little bit isolated in the beginning, but once I actually got to know a group and got to know other people...
Hang on, is it still recording?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we talk about isolation?
Yeah, well, like I said, isolation was a small part of it at the beginning, but then once I actually got to know a social group and started to get to more comfortable
Okay,
with
let's
the
forget
course
that. I think we'll move on to perhaps problems with supervision. It's another key area of my research. What sort of kind of problems did you have?
I'm not sure that I had a huge amount of problems.
Well, you must
with
have had some
supervision.
problems in supervision.
Well, I think it was mixed. Like lots of people that do PhDs, you have mixed experience of your supervision. But I think for me,
Yeah,
what
but
was
everyone
really
else I've spoken to have had problems in supervision. So what were the kind of problems you had in supervision?
Well, I suppose there were issues about content and structure, but I think sometimes actually what I really
So you
found
did
was
have a lot of problems in supervision then?
I'm not sure that I'd say a lot. Maybe.
Oh, crikey, sorry.
Okay.
Hello? Oh, yeah, sorry Alex, 1 second. Yeah, I'll be there at 7 o'clock. Okay, brilliant. Sorry. So you had a lot of problems with supervision, you felt isolated doing a PhD.
I suppose you could say that parts of that were true, but there were also lots of other
that's brilliant. Thank you very much. That's basically what I wanted to get out of this project.
Will I find out anything about the project and a bit of context and?
Yeah, well after I've written it up, you can have a look at it, I'm sure.
And also, can I have a record of the interview after
Well,
you've finished?
maybe after it, but I'll write it up. And it'll be fine. You know, I've been through ethics. It's great. It's all great. So you know, that isolation and problems of doing a PhD and everything will be brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so hopefully it should be fairly obvious to you why that's a bad interview, but I just want to flag up some things which I find particularly problematic about that interview, and then I'll use that as a bit of a launch pad to talk about good attributes of an interview in the next slide. Okay, so he's obviously very argumentative there. It's quite a combative interview. He also doesn't really listen, so he doesn't use any active listening techniques. He talks over the person, he interrupts, he imposes his research agenda on her. The interviewee tries to talk about her own experience, and that's kind of flattened out by the researcher. He has a very clear idea of what he wants to find out, what he's interested in, and what he's not interested in. And again, put yourself in the position of the interviewee, how that would feel to have someone talk over you, to have someone tell you how you should feel, for example, what you must have experienced, as opposed to genuinely showing curiosity and interest in hearing you talk about your own experiences, okay? What he also fails to do, and you see this in particular at the end of the interview, is he has failed to secure informed consent from the participant beforehand. So in the end of the interview, you hear that the interviewee is unsure about how their data will be used, what the nature of the project is, whether they'll be able to gain access to their transcript after publishing and so forth. And that's something that can easily be avoided, as I'll talk about later, by making sure that the interviewee is informed of the nature of the study beforehand, how their data will be used, about whether they have the right to opt out of the study or not, about their right to be anonymized should they so wish, so they can't be identified in the finished publication and so forth. Okay, so ultimately, when I see your guys' interviews later on, let's hope that it's nothing like that particular example. Okay, so there are some good hints and tips from the literature as to what components should make up a good research interview. So I want to flag up here 10 characteristics of a good interview that were put forward by a really prominent social science researcher called Cavall. So Cavall writes extensively about, in particular, qualitative research methods and things like interviews, ethnography, and so forth. So Cavall outlined 10 features of what they thought made up a good interview. So I'll talk about these now in turn. So the first is that the interviewer should be knowledgeable about the topic. So again, please keep in mind, you guys will be conducting literature reviews, looking at academic sources and so forth, in order to gain insight into how academic research has talked about leadership skills and practices in your country. And this is really vital when it comes to developing your question guide, okay? Now keep in mind, if you're speaking to someone, you want to sound like you're informed, you're professional, and you're knowledgeable about the thing that you're researching, okay? So when you eventually speak to C-level managers or scholars on leadership in the country you're investigating, you want to sound like you know what you're talking about. So that's the first and perhaps the most important aspect of what goes into a good interview. The next is structure. So as you may have noticed in that bad interview example that I just played, everything was kind of all over the place, okay? And you really need to make sure that that's not how you conduct your interview. So you want to make sure that there's a clear structure to the program. And you can communicate that structure to the person in advance by perhaps conducting a pre-interview or by showing them the interview guide and some of the questions that you're interested in answering. So you want to have a bit of an introduction to your interview. This is where you can once again reiterate the purpose of the study, what you're interested in finding out. You can also talk to the person about research ethics and gain their informed consent. So again, you can reiterate what will happen with their data, whether they're happy with that. You can reiterate that they have the opportunity to be anonymized in the final publication and so forth. After that, you then want to move on to the main body of the interview, which is your main interview guide, the main questions that you're interested in asking. And this will also include things like probes, prompts, and summaries. Okay? And then finally, at the end, you want to obviously make sure that you thank the person for taking part. And you also want to provide them with the opportunity to perhaps raise an additional point that you feel or they feel hasn't been talked about. Okay, so this is another nice little technique that you can use in order to gain further insight into a country. And that can be as simple as just saying, is there anything that's important about understanding leadership in your country that you feel we haven't covered today? Also, you may ask them to perhaps give you an impactful quote that you can also use somewhere in your CP, perhaps in the introduction or perhaps in the conclusion, to end the CP in a really powerful way. So, as well as this, you want to make sure when you're conducting interviews that your questions are clear. So they should be simple, easy, and ideally short. So you shouldn't have double-barreled questions or questions that have 2 or 3 or 4 sub-questions included within them. Keep them short, keep them simple. That way, you make sure that the person is covering each question. If you have 2 or 3 questions or sub-questions within a question, then what happens is some points get covered and others are forgotten about or lost. The other thing you want to do is try and avoid using academic language in your interviews. So again, keep in mind, some of your leaders may not have read scholarly material on leadership skills and practices. They may not be aware of who Hofstede is, and they may not be aware of concepts like power, distance, and empathic understanding. So find a way of getting at the particular material you need in such a way that uses more ordinary or leadership management language, okay? Now, in contrast to the bad interview that I just played, be gentle with the people that you're interviewing. Don't be argumentative, don't talk over them, and don't interrupt, okay? It comes across as rude, and it comes across as not being interested in what people are saying. Now, it's also important to try and tolerate pauses, okay? So please keep that in mind, and I'll mention that in a little bit when I talk about the usefulness of silence. The next thing that's an important aspect of a good interview is to be sensitive. So listen carefully. Remember, sometimes you will be investigating an expert in a country that you know nothing about, that is very different to your own culture, for example. So it's very important to actively listen and to empathize with the person that you're interviewing, to be open-minded, curious, and so forth, to try and understand their world in their shoes. Now, I'll talk about the importance of an interview guide in a moment, but it's also really important to be open, and you need to try and respond to what the interviewee finds important and respond to what they're actually talking about. So in the bad example I played earlier, what you often saw is that the interviewer would interrupt and basically say, I'm not interested in that. I want to talk about this. And again, that can lead to people feeling like they're not listened or that their experiences and expertise and knowledge are not valued. And that's the last thing we want to do. So you need to strike a balance between being flexible, to allowing the interviewee to take the interview in different directions, following up on things, probing, prompting, and so forth, and also making sure that you steer it back to what your specific research questions are. Because remember, we do have specific information that we want to find out here. So in this respect, you guys are conducting interviews that we would call semi-structured. There is a structure, there is an interview guide, but you also want to be open to allow people to talk about things that they find important. So the next thing is be careful about being too critical. So in that bad interview, you basically saw the person disagree with what the interviewee was saying at times, saying you must have felt isolated, you must have felt lonely because other people who I've interviewed have said as much. So you don't necessarily want to be like that, of course. But it might be helpful to highlight perhaps some inconsistencies or perhaps even some contradictions in what your interviewee has said. So say, for example, someone says that they are a deeply autocratic leader and that ultimately when they make decisions, their subordinates have no choice but to listen to it. But perhaps they might tell a story later in the interview that involves an example of decision making whereby the whole team were involved in making a decision. So perhaps in that instance you could flag up and say, oh, that specific example you talked about didn't sound very autocratic. It actually sounded very kind of consensus-based decision making. But what you're doing is you're allowing the interviewee the opportunity to clarify, to talk about why that specific example they mentioned might have been different or how it ties in with their more general approach to leadership. Okay. Now, a crucial skill that you'll need to develop in order to be able to be critical in that respect is memory. So it's really fundamentally important to try and remember what your interviewee has talked about. So if they've told you extensively about their work experience and how that involved moving across multiple countries, the last thing you want to do later on in the interview is be surprised by them talking about being a manager in Italy, and you suddenly say, oh, I didn't know you were a manager in Italy. And they say, oh, I told you earlier, remember, in the first couple of interviews, I worked there for 5 years, as well as working in Papua New Guinea. So it's really important. It makes people feel that they're listened to and respected. So try and take notes, but again, make sure that you're actively listening and remembering. It's also a nice technique that you can use when asking questions. So for example, you could say, earlier you mentioned that you have also been a manager in several countries. Could you perhaps say a little bit more about how that's impacted on your leadership skills and leadership style, for example? Again, it makes people feel listened to, and it shows that you've actively listened and are building upon what they're saying. And finally, it can sometimes be useful to try and interpret what people are saying. Remember, ultimately, we're trying to accurately reflect what someone's experience is, and you'll be directly quoting what they're saying to you, of course, in specific sections of your CP. So it's really important to make sure that you're accurately depicting what they're talking about. And one simple technique you can use in a good interview is just to clarify some things or to summarize something. So for example, you could say, could I just summarize what you've just said there? Are you telling me that you used to be a more transformational leader, but in recent years you've shifted towards a more transactional style? So managing and more closely managing and monitoring your staff. Is that a fair summation? That then gives the interviewee the opportunity to confirm that or to add more detail. Say, oh no, it's not quite that. Actually, it's this. That's really important, okay? So it's another good skill that you can use in a good interview. And remember, the interview, like everything in this course, is in itself a cross-cultural encounter. You'll be speaking to perhaps someone in a country that you've never visited and perhaps never will visit. This might be a country whose cultural background, cultural values and norms are sometimes very different from that of the country that you grew up in or that you're living in currently. So it's really important that you're empathetic, you're warm, you're curious, you're open-minded when speaking to people, okay? And you need to be actively engaged with the respondent, with the people that you're speaking to. So you have to strike that balance between being engaged, open, curious, but at the same time knowing that you're speaking to them for a specific purpose, to elicit specific information that helps you write the best possible chapter you can. And in this respect, when I talk about the interview guide in a few moments, it's really important to learn your interview guide, okay? You can't necessarily follow it religiously, because if you do, it can come across as too robotic and too rehearsed. So what you want to make sure that you do is that you learn it to the extent that you can forget it. So this is sometimes a technique that actors talk about. They talk about learning a script so much and then eventually letting go of it. It fades away. It becomes and feels natural. And that's what I'd like you guys to try and do for your interviews. But that will take practice. So you should practice your interviews several times before you actually conduct them. Okay? And then finally, in any cross-cultural encounter, it's really important to actively listen. Okay, you're trying to understand the world from someone else's perspective. So you can use simple active listening techniques like, wow, could you please tell me more about that? Or could you perhaps give me a specific example of what you're just talking about there? That's really interesting. That's exactly the kind of thing we're looking for our CP. Now, there are different types of listening, and there are multiple examples, of course, of this if you look online and so forth. But I just want to highlight a couple of examples of different types of listening. One good and one perhaps not so good for conducting research like this. So the first one is reflexive listening. So this is kind of a natural, intuitive part of how people try and relate to each other, particularly to friends and to loved ones, etc. So what happens here is reflexive listening is really what we hear in our own minds. So when someone begins to talk about their experiences, what we tend to do is our imaginations tend to paint pictures. We start to kind of put ourselves in the perspective of what that person is talking about. We say, oh, that happened to me, or I had a similar experience to that. Now that can be a nice way through which we show empathy with people when we're talking to them in conversations, but it's not always a good skill to use in research interviews. So although it's perfectly natural, and of course images will come into your mind when someone is talking to you about leadership skills in their country, try and suspend that temptation to get carried away by your own imagination. What I'd like you to do instead is to engage in critical listening. And the objective in critical listening is to be evaluative. You're analysing the message. You're analysing what actually someone is saying in order to figure out whether it's important or relevant for what you're studying. Okay? So suspend the temptation to paint a picture of what it must be like in that country. What you're trying to do is to actively listen to what that person is talking about. The only way you can gain insight into leadership skills and practices in the countries you're investigating is through their knowledge and expertise, not your imaginations, okay? And of course, last but not least, silence is really important. So there's a nice Bob Dylan quote that illustrates this. There are things I could say, but I don't. So silence is a really effective technique because of its emptiness. You actually don't have to do anything, okay? But sometimes the kind of commonsensical idea is that silence can sometimes be a sign of disinterest or that it's passive. But actually how I like to think about silence is that it's an inactive intervention. So what I mean by that is that you actually do something by doing nothing. And try and practice this over the course of this week. Practice it with friends. Practice it with your loved ones, for example. Resist that temptation to immediately say something when someone says something to you. And what it does is it places the impetus back onto that person to keep talking. So when you're conducting an interview with a cross-cultural trainer or a leader in your country, sometimes when they finish a point, resist that temptation to immediately jump in and ask something else. Allow there to be a small pause. And what you'll see is that very often that person will then add something else. They might add an additional detail, or they might cite a specific example that illustrates what they've just said. So use silence as and when you can. Now, what I'd like you guys to also do over the course of this week is to try and conduct a practice interview. So what we'd ideally like you to do is to try and reach out to someone via the course WhatsApp group or via Facebook and try and conduct a very short 2-3 minute interview with someone from another team, from another country, okay? And what I'd like you to do is to interview them about how they've experienced leadership within the organization that they work for currently or an organization that they have worked for previously. And this can be a real nice opportunity to practice, develop, and to reflect afterwards on the interview process. Because remember, we don't want the first interview you do in the next 2 months to be with that professional. Okay? Ideally, we want you to have practiced this in advance. So you've anticipated some of the problems, some of the challenges that can take place when you're speaking to someone. So please try and do that this week. Okay? Now, I mentioned earlier that in order to include some structure into the interview, remember, it's not a normal conversation in that respect. It's more formal, it's more structured, there are rules and so forth, rules over who talks when. Okay, so a nice way to introduce some structure into proceedings is to develop an interview guide. Okay, but please keep in mind, this should just help provide a bit of structure, a bit of a skeleton, if you will, but you shouldn't stick to it rigidly. As I say, then it can sound too robotic, too rehearsed. So have a guide there, learn that guide, be clear about what you're interested in, but also be open and curious to go with where the interviewee takes you, okay? So the first thing is write down some of your research questions. Later on, I'll show some examples from Team Bahamas of what their research questions look like. And these should correspond to the different sections in the CP and the different types of information that you need to write about. Now, secondly, you want to try and shape these questions to fit the expertise of the people who you're talking to. So if someone's experience is primarily of the public sector in the country that you're investigating, then it might not make sense to continually ask them about leaderships and skills and practices in the private sector, for example. So it's really important that you look at the biography of the person that you're studying via LinkedIn or other kind of sites like ResearchGate, that you've had a look at their publications, for example, and you're really clear about what their expertise is. Okay? Now, thirdly, what you want to do is try and ask as many how questions rather than why questions. And that's useful because it helps us gain insight into processes. So, for example, how did you come to manage in this particular way? How did you come to adopt this particular leadership style? What that does is it forces somebody to provide an account of how they've got to that particular point. Okay? They'll provide a narrative which is full of rich experiential detail. That's the kind of goal that we're looking for. Okay? Now, the next thing you want to do is to try and develop some probes and some prompts to try and elicit more detailed responses to key questions. So this can be as simple as just saying, could you please give me a specific example of what you've just talked about? Okay, of how you've demonstrated empathic understanding towards the subordinates in your organization. Now 5, as I mentioned earlier, you want to structure the interview in particular ways. So it's also sometimes useful just to begin with a warm-up question. So this might not always be directly related to the CP, but what it does is it just helps to establish some rapport, helps to make you check that the audio levels and everything are good, okay? Before you get into some of the more juicier questions. And this ties into the next point. Think about the logical flow of the interview. What topics should come first? What kind of topics follow on more or less naturally from one another? So if you're talking about hierarchy in the organizations that you're studying, it might make sense to talk about gender inequality or class-based inequality or hierarchy being based on age in that particular section, as opposed to right at the beginning of the interview. So really think in advance and collaborate with your different team members to think what makes sense to ask when. And finally, in order to kind of complete, you want to make sure that there's some closure to the interview. You want the person to feel like glad that they've taken part in the interview. You want to reiterate the purpose of the study, how their data might be used, and the fact that they also have the right to withdraw or to be anonymized in the study at any point. And this just helps to bring proceedings to a close. And again, it just looks more professional to do it like this. Now, you've got your interview guide, you've learned that, and you've kind of allowed it to drift away so you can be natural in the interview process. It's also good to use a variety of different types of questions in order to elicit the kind of information that you need. So for example, you could use direct questions such as, do you find it easy to manage underperforming staff? Now you might not want to start straight away with a direct question like this. You might want to build up to it once you've established rapport with the person you're talking to. But then there are also indirect questions. Okay, so you might say, what do most people around here think of the ways that management treats its staff? And then once they provided an account of that, you could perhaps follow it up by asking, is that how you feel too? And what this helps to do is to get insight into their individual perspective. Okay? And then finally, you can also use things like structured questions to say things like, okay, I'd now like to move on to a new topic. And this is useful because it helps to keep the interview flowing. It helps to keep things on track. And what it could also do is it also gives the interviewee the opportunity to go, okay, I'd just like to say one more point about hierarchy before we move on to talk about something else. And there are also things like follow-up questions, as I mentioned before. So could you say more about that, please? And again, because we're interested in gaining rich, insightful detail, what's always good is to try and get specific examples of something, because you can use these examples to illustrate points that have come from the academic sources or to illustrate points that have been made by the survey respondents. And these quotes add more detail and more layers to these examples. So you could say, for example, what did you do then? How did your staff react to this particular initiative or shift in leadership styles and practices? And then finally, there's interpreting questions. And another way of rephrasing this would be to call them summarizing questions. So this is just an opportunity for you to clarify that your interpretation of the interviewee's account is accurate. And it's really good to try and do that in the moment, as opposed to somebody feeling in 1 month or 2 months' time that you've misquoted them as such. So for example, you could say, do you mean to say that your leadership role has had to change from one of encouraging others towards a more directive style? You could say, is that a fair summation of what you're saying? And again, you're giving the interviewee the opportunity to clarify, to add detail, or to say, no, that's not exactly what I meant. What I meant to say was X and Y. So use these different types of questions at different points in the interview to elicit the information you need. So now I just want to show an example from Team Brazil in a previous semester, and I mainly want to show this to illustrate some of the CCBS branding and to give you an idea of what the final product should look like for your YouTube video. So I'll play it now. So you can see the introductory clip here.
And I am a Brazilian cross-cultural professional with expertise in international business communications.
So you can see there that the interviewer can't be heard. The question is on the screen, like we see here. Also the CCBS logo at the top there.
It's important to be aware of all the diversity, that it's a mix. What makes the Brazilian culture very unique is the mix of different cultures that were incorporated to our society, like the Italians and the Germans and the Jewish people, the Japanese people, and even the Dutch people have the north coast of Brazil until the 17th century used to belong to the Dutch. So it's important to know a little bit of the history about culture, the diversity, the contrast, the complexity that all this contrast and diversity represents. It's a very warming environment, but at the same time it's very competitive, and
Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea, a kind of visual illustration of what your final product should look like. So remember, in textbook, there's all the details you need about that editing process, about how we want the finished product to look. And on OneDrive, in the interviews folder, there's also all sorts of templates that you can download and incorporate and edit into both your YouTube video interview and your SoundCloud audio interview. Okay? So I raised this issue earlier when talking about the bad interview example. So again, it's really important that you secure informed consent from the people who are taking part. So what do I mean by informed consent? Well, someone can only consent to take part in the project if they're informed about what the study is about. So in your communication, so both in your initial invitations to people to take part in an interview, but also in the beginning of the interview itself, you again need to reiterate the purpose of the study, the rights that they have as participants, how their data will be used. So for example, you want to mention that it may be used for educational purposes. So it could feature in a lecture such as this, for example, in future years. And also you want to mention that ideally you would like to directly quote them. So directly quote their kind of experience and knowledge in your CPs. Now there's a spectrum of anonymity. So some people might be happy to give their names, their roles, and the business sector that they work in or the organization that they work for. Some people may just want to state their position and the company that they work for. Some people might want to remain completely anonymous, okay? But ultimately that is up to the respondents themselves. But you need to make sure that they're informed about this so that they know what they're consenting to. And as I mentioned there, anonymity and confidentiality are really important. So people have the right to not have their names mentioned, for example, in the study if they don't want to. Now, we're not necessarily gathering really sensitive information, so hopefully most of the people who you'll interview will be happy to give their name, title, and the organization that they work for. It also helps to make our data look more valid as well and more legitimate by knowing what kind of prestigious people have agreed to take part in the particular study. And remember, for them taking part, you can always agree to send them a free PDF copy of the final book once it's available. Now, this is an example of the template form for audio-video recording consent. So this is available on OneDrive in the interview folder. And as you can see here, this basically just reiterates what the purpose of the study is. It also talks about how their data will be used. So they mention that it might be used in presentations or in written products resulting from the study. So by the end of this, the person who's agreeing to take part should be really clear about how their data will be used, the fact that they're being recorded in the audio or the video interview, and the fact that this recording might be on our YouTube channel and available for people to see in future years. And after that, you want to make sure that you secure their consent, either in audio form and also in written form. But again, everything you need to know in that respect is in the folders in OneDrive and in textbook. So I just want to kind of gradually bring the lecture to a close by showing some examples from previous semester. So some examples of interview guides and also some examples of transcriptions and how people have begun to analyze the interviews to use the data in their CPs. So here is just an example of the interview guide from Team Bahamas. It's not necessarily perfect, but I just want to flag up some of the things they have done. So you can see here there's a bit of structure to their interview. They talk about, before they start the interview, they have 2 questions concerning the legality or the ethics of the interview. So they ask for permission for the interview to be recorded. So in the bad interview example earlier, this wasn't the case. Okay, the person didn't know until the interview was already happening. You don't want to do that. Make sure they know in advance. And also they ask whether they can cite their full name when quoting them in the chapter of the book, or whether they want to be anonymized. Okay, very important. So that should come at the beginning of the interview. And next they have some introductory questions related to the person's knowledge, experience, and career history. Helps them introduce who they are before they begin to answer more specific questions. Now, they've also structured the guide in relation to specific topics. So here there are some general questions about leadership in the Bahamas, for example. Okay. So, for example, question 4, do you think leadership in the Bahamas has changed in recent decades, especially since the increase of multinational companies in the Bahamas? So for most of the teams, this is quite a relevant question. You're interested in, has there been any historical shifts in relation to leadership? And is this driven by globalization, by transnational corporations moving more into these particular countries and so forth? Okay? So you can look at these questions in your own time, of course. So I will move on. And next they have a section of questions which is dedicated to exploring hierarchy. So obviously there is a specific question, a specific section in the CP which deals with hierarchy. So you can see here they have a series of questions related to that. So in particular, in relation to question 7 and question 8, they're talking about the differences in between men and women, for example, which corresponds with a particular survey question. And they're also asking about the relationship between age and hierarchy. So remember, in all of the countries that you're studying, there will be a basis for hierarchy in that country. Sometimes this is in terms of social class, sometimes this is in relation to gender, sometimes this is in relation to a caste system, sometimes this is in relation to ethnicity, for example. So asking questions like this can help to elicit more information about what the basis for hierarchy is, how organizations and the societies in which these organizations are based are structured. What is the basis for that hierarchy? And also here, they're trying to get some nice examples of what an ideal leader looks like in the Bahamas. So they're trying to identify specific attributes that make up a great Bahamian leader. Okay. The other thing that they do well, and I think this is something that you should all try and implement in your interviews, is they've tried to find examples. They've asked the person, do you have any examples of great native Bahamian books on leadership, for example? Okay. So this can be a nice way of trying to find more sources. What you might find is they might say, oh yeah, there's a really great business scholar that I work with in the country who's carried out research on our organization before. I'll put you in touch with them. That might be really useful. Okay. And that might be a way through which you find the interviewee for your leadership, for your scholar interview. Okay. So ask questions about an ideal type. It's really useful. Now here, I just want to finish today's lecture by showing you examples of what transcription looks like. Okay, so I want to flag up a couple of things here. So remember, once you've conducted your interviews, we need you to fully transcribe those interviews in written form. So we use verbatim transcription, and all that means is you're just quoting word for word everything that's said in the interview. So what you can see here is a thing called a timestamp. So what that does is it just shows when in the video the person is making that particular point. And in textbook, Xander provides a step-by-step guide as to how to get YouTube to do that for you. So YouTube can automatically transcribe your video for you and also automatically include these timestamps. That's really useful. But you also cite some examples of other specialist software, free and paid, that will do transcription work for you. Alternatively, you can of course do this manually by listening to the YouTube and audio video and transcribing it yourself. But you will need to produce transcripts like this and upload them into OneDrive. Now, the second thing I want to flag up there is that you'll see that there are some sections that are highlighted in yellow here. And also on the next page, this is an audio interview from Team Nigeria. Again, you see the timestamps, and they have sections that are highlighted in blue. Okay, so what these are is this is an example of kind of preliminary analysis. So what these teams have begun to do here is to highlight specific sections in these interviews that they think are useful for the CP. So they can use these specific highlighted sections. They could directly quote them in the CP, for example. They could use them to cite examples of particular things that are brought up in the surveys, or they could use them to support and illustrate perhaps points that have been made in the academic research as well. So one person in your team ideally should have the specific role of trawling through the data, trawling through the transcripts, and finding the rich, insightful details that you need to include in your CPs. Okay? And highlighting is just one of the ways through which you can do this, either online or some people prefer to do it with pens and paper, different colors, highlighters, and so on and so forth. Now, I want to conclude by just letting you hear an example of a audio interview. Okay, so this again comes from Team Nigeria, and I just want to use it as an example to flag up some of the branding and some of the flourishes that we use in order to make the audio interview sound as professional as possible.
Cross-cultural business skills. Expert interviews.
The university promoted me to be the head of internal audit. Right now, I will be rounding up my MSc in leadership.
Are there any specific leadership styles or traits that Nigerian leaders have?
I would say that most succeeding leaders, business leaders in Nigeria, they are more or less autocratic. Not by their own desire to say, but because of the system. This is the best leadership style to use. You have to use situational leadership because things are not just stable, so you want to diligently adopt a situational leadership kind of, a situational style of leadership.
So what you can see there is that there's also kind of some audio branding, right? We have the introduction at the video, and what you will have probably picked up on as well is that there's a musical sample playing in the background there. So anyone who listens to podcasts is probably quite familiar with this, either consciously or perhaps subconsciously perhaps. You might not even be aware of that you're hearing it. But this is something that's quite nice in terms of keeping momentum, helps to keep flow, and again, it adds to that level of professionalism. So again, on OneDrive, there's some examples of samples that you can use and add this in the editing process to your audio interview. Now please keep in mind the finished SoundCloud audio interview ideally should only be somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes long. But when you're producing the transcripts of that interview, we want you to transcribe the raw interview, which might be much longer. Okay, but the final SoundCloud interview that you upload onto OneDrive should be edited and really just include the most impactful, rich, insightful information about leadership in your country. Okay. And as I say, CCBS identity. Here we have a very strong branding, very strong standardized branding. So again, please refer to textbook about how to make sure that you guys follow all of those small branding issues when conducting your YouTube video interview and also your SoundCloud audio interview. Remember, this does form part of the marking criteria, so it's important that you adhere to those particular standards, okay? And again, if you're unsure, please go to the YouTube page and have a look at previous examples of how teams have conducted interviews and learn from what they do well and perhaps learn to avoid doing some of the things that they don't do so well. But please have a look at this in your own time and follow the good examples. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the comment section below the lecture post on Facebook. Other than that, I will say goodbye for now, and I'll see you on Zoom or in class next week. Bye bye.